How do you improve on perfection? The GTX 1080 Ti is, in hindsight, probably the most well-regarded premium GPU Nvidia ever released. Team Green themselves must have known they'd probably gone a little too far, giving the $700 Pascal card too much power for its price points. Not necessarily for some conspiratorial, evil capitalist reasons. Or, okay, not just for evil capitalist reasons, but rather because a year and a half later, they'd be expected to do it again. The RTX 2080 Ti launched in the second half of 2018, at the head of an attempted revolution. The RTX series were the first consumer-grade products to enable real-time ray tracing, a development Nvidia were so confident in that by the following generation, the whole range would be known as RTX, and the old GTX label would be slowly retired. The RTX prefix indicated that Nvidia was going to have a whole new metric to judge their graphics cards by, and one that their competitors at AMD initially had no answer for. For this reason, Nvidia seemed to have felt justified in correcting the biggest mistake about the 1080 Ti. They slapped an extra $300 on the price tag. Gamers and the tech press were skeptical of RTX. At launch, there were scarcely any games which made use of ray tracing or DLSS, the other major feature of the RTX package. And even when they did become available, the tech just wasn't impressive. RT's benefit was subtle, yet its performance impact was severe, and DLSS was far from the lossless performance increase that was promised. Before the initial benchmarks came out, there was conjecture that the 2080 Ti wouldn't be any benefit on the 1080 Ti at all, thanks mainly to Nvidia's ham-fisted marketing and focus on ray tracing. And for the first time, a Ti class card didn't have a VRAM bump over its predecessor. Even if it was a better performer than the previous gen in regular, non-ray-traced games, it didn't seem like the $1,000 price tag was going to be justified. I'm not going to be testing ray tracing in this video. I have a separate one in mind that will go more in-depth about first-gen ray tracing hardware and how it's holding up 6 years later. For this video, I'll be running the 2080 Ti through my usual battery of gaming tests, including a few new titles that have released in recent weeks, and comparing them to my updated results from the GTX 1080 Ti to see how much better the Turing card actually was, and how much better it held up. As usual, I'm testing using the 2024 moderately priced gaming PC featuring a Ryzen 5 7500F and 32 gigs of DDR5. Starting off extremely strong with Horizon Forbidden West. This game has only just been released for the PC, and despite, or because it's a port of a cross-gen PlayStation title, it lacks any kind of ray tracing. Still, it's a pretty phenomenal looking game, and even if the 2080 Ti can't flex its RT muscles here, it does have the VRAM and overall horsepower to drive 1440p very high at just over 60 FPS with lows of 52. Compared to the 1080 Ti, the older models simply can't compare. While some compromises to quality settings could potentially achieve a 60 FPS experience, at like-for-like settings it's coming in at about 45 FPS. DLSS has proven to be an important string to the 2080 Ti's bow, and enabling it brings averages up to the mid-70s and 1% lows are over 60, making this an ideal, near-lossless option that will help with performance drops in later, more demanding parts of the game world. The 1080 Ti relies on FSR instead, which, while still better than nothing, is slightly more prone to artifacts, and even with it enabled, it still falls short of the 60 mark. On the flip side of the story for 2023 and 24 releases, Alan Wake 2 wants to punish owners of older GPUs. Or rather, it's been designed to showcase modern rendering techniques and boasts some of the best character models and scenery you've ever seen in a game. And that shit's expensive, computationally speaking. The RTX 2080 Ti can just about cover the cost of mesh shaders, and at 1440p high it can deliver 42 FPS on average with lows in the 30s. The 1080 Ti has been shown mercy in recent weeks, and a recent update has dramatically improved performance on this generation of card, but that still only means for 26 FPS at the same settings. Turning on DLSS helps the RTX card tremendously, bringing the average up over the 60 mark. However, the 1080 Ti falls a long way short even with FSR, as its average is almost half that of the 2080 Ti. While Alan Wake 2 is quite an open book when it comes to upscaling, Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora is a bit more obscure. The game's menu isn't exactly clear what internal resolution is being used. While it would be fair to assume it's using the normal DLSS upscaling presets, Ultra Quality is an option, which isn't something DLSS officially supports. With this Ultra Quality option chosen, DLSS enabled, and the Ultra Quality settings preset, the 2080 Ti completes the benchmark run with 44 frames per second. The 1080 Ti only hits 25 at those same settings, with FSR replacing DLSS, and minimums fall into the teens. Both cards will benefit from more severe upscaling, however, dropping to balanced doesn't help as much as you'd hope, bringing the Turing's average up to 50, and the Pascal's only as far as 33. To get a decent experience with these cards, you'd probably need to drop settings. Helldivers II can run pretty well on both generations of Ti card at 1440 Ultra, so long as you use some upscaling. The 2080 Ti can do the job just fine at quality, averaging a healthy 77 FPS with 1% lows of 68. The 1080 Ti, meanwhile, needs a few more compromises to achieve a solid 60+, as at the same settings it averages just below that mark. Starfield, despite everything, needs something like a 7800 XT or equivalent to deliver 1440 Ultra at 60 FPS. The 2080 Ti is just over halfway there, scoring 36 FPS on average without any kind of upscaling. Turning on DLSS can see that average climb up to 48, which would be a bit more palatable, but to really get to 60, you're going to have to drop quality settings too. The 1080 Ti, meanwhile, is borderline unplayable at 25 FPS without resolution scaling, and while FSR brings that up over 30, 1% lows are still disappointingly cinematic. RE4 Remake has proven it can really fly, even on older tech, so long as you have the VRAM or are happy to drop settings a little. Alas, even 11GB isn't quite enough for the max preset at 1440p, so I tested the 2080 Ti at graphics priority, and it returned an extremely playable 98 FPS average. The 1080 Ti having the same amount of VRAM means it can run at the same preset without issue, and still gives a very acceptable 73 FPS. Although more notorious as a memory hog than RE4, The Last of Us actually is a bit more tolerant of these 11GB GPUs. I was able to run both cards at 1440 Ultra without so much as causing a warning in the settings menu. That being said, Ultra may have been a bit of a stretch for these particular cards, as the 2080 Ti only managed about 52 FPS. The 1080 Ti can still produce a 30+ average at native 1440 and the same preset, but staying above 30 requires upscaling. DLSS-Q helps bring the RTX card up to a far more PC-friendly 68 FPS, and FSR brings the GTX up to a smoother but still suboptimal 48. As an aside, I didn't capture any footage from the 1080 Ti, but I'd argue this is a pretty good implementation of FSR too, and without doing a side-by-side, I'd have struggled to tell that it wasn't DLSS. It's still possible to crank up Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart to the maximum quality preset on the 2080 Ti and get a playable experience, even at 1440p. Without ray tracing anyway. The very high settings return an average FPS of 68.8, which is over 15 FPS better than the 1080 Ti at the same settings. You could also play with RT maxed out, but at a more console-esque 43 FPS and with cinematic lows. I'll talk more about this game and ray tracing in a dedicated video on that subject in a few weeks' time. And you can bet this game will feature in that video too. Cyberpunk might be the RT poster child and the flagship title for the latest tech like path tracing, ray reconstruction, and deep learning frame generation, but for now I'm just looking at rasterization performance. The 2080 Ti can run at 1440 Ultra with pretty much bang on 60 FPS, though of course that's not really good enough for a 60 FPS experience. Frame rates can vary pretty wildly depending on the area you're in. The 1080 Ti only manages 35 FPS at native resolution, so upscaling is a good idea in both cases. DLSS brings the 2080 Ti's average up to almost 75, and while FSR can bring the 1080 Ti up to 50, sadly, this game's implementation of FSR is a bit subpar. Forza Horizon 5's RT implementation can be a bit confusing, so I'll quickly explain. Both cards were tested at 1440p using the Extreme preset, which by default sets the RT level to high. Being an RT-capable card, you might think that puts the 2080 Ti at a disadvantage. However, any RT level in this game below Ultra doesn't actually apply in gameplay, and only affects Photo mode and Forza Vista mode. Without in-game RT, the 2080 Ti scores over 76 FPS. The 1080 Ti just fails to hit the 60 average at the same settings, so ideally it would benefit from running with some upscaling or at a lower preset. Incidentally, with the in-game RT turned on, the 2080 Ti only loses 5 frames, which is entirely appropriate as the in-game RT reflections are barely noticeable. The Extreme preset might not be the optimal way of playing Warzone competitively, but it helps ensure the CPU isn't the limiting factor. Both the 2080 Ti and 1080 Ti are capable of 100+ at lower settings, and if you want to pick up a less expensive card for esports, either one of these would be great. But that's not the question I'm asking today. The question is, how much faster is the 2080 Ti than its predecessor? And the answer is about 28%. The 2080 Ti can run 1440 Extreme at over 90 FPS, whereas the 1080 Ti is a little over 70. Now that the scalper pandemic is starting to fade from the popular memory, I think my videos about older GPUs are starting to trend away from consumer advice and more towards tech nostalgia. However, perhaps this card more than most should be approached with caution. There's been a known issue with some older RTX 2080 Ti models, specifically around their VRAM. There's some information online about which models to look out for. I believe cards with Micron memory modules are particularly susceptible, but either way, if you did take this review as a sign that you should buy a 2080 Ti in 2024, I'd recommend doing your due diligence before whipping out your payment method. I don't think anyone genuinely expected the 2080 Ti to be merely a 1080 Ti with ray tracing bolted onto it, but this seems to prove it was actually a pretty big upgrade. In the closest comparisons, the Turing card wins by about 30%, and in the most extreme cases, the gap can widen to 70% or higher. I don't think that will change the minds of anyone who stuck with the 1080 Ti back in 2018. The Pascal card still aged remarkably well, and its lower initial asking price contributes to why it's still so fondly remembered. But I think the Turing follow-up maybe wasn't quite as bad value as a lot of us may have thought, but I understand why we did. At the time, it would have been borderline insulting to suggest that DLSS was a selling point at the high end. Nobody wanted to spend $1,000 on a graphics card whose highlight feature involved dropping the rendering resolution. Surely you pay the big bucks to avoid having to make those kinds of compromises. But in the long run, it's a tech that's proving to help keep the 2080 Ti relevant in 2024 and beyond. The other big headline feature of the 2080 Ti was, of course, ray tracing. However, that's going to be the subject of another video. In the meantime, thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.